The building felt wrong for Christmas Eve. Haverford Dynamics was usually loud even when it pretended to be quiet. Printers humming, keyboards tapping, someone always laughing too hard down the hall. But that afternoon, the 23rd floor sounded like an empty church. Every footstep echoed longer than it should have. Danielle Brooks sat at her desk, the glow of her monitor reflecting off the framed photo beside her keyboard. Her son was smiling in the picture, front teeth missing, arms wrapped around a bike he'd borrowed from a neighbor that summer. She turned the frame slightly as if angling it away might make the guilt ease. Most of the office had cleared out by noon. A few people had waved on their way to the elevators, coats already on, voices light with holiday plans. Danielle had smiled back, told them she'd be right behind them. She always said that. Outside the windows, downtown Chicago disappeared behind falling snow. Big flakes drifted sideways, blurring the buildings across the street. The city looked softer that way. Quieter. Forgiving. Her phone buzzed against the desk. She didn't need to look to know who it was. Her mother had called twice already. The school had closed early because of the storm, and Danielle had promised she'd pick her son up before 3. She glanced at the clock in the corner of her screen. 2:14 p.m. Just a few more minutes, she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. She'd stayed late to double-check a set of numbers Leonard Whitcomb wanted finalized before year's end. He'd sent the request the night before. Short. Direct. No greeting. Just an attachment and a line that read, "Need confirmation by tomorrow." Danielle prided herself on being careful. Careful people survived. Careful people didn't make mistakes that cost them jobs or reputations. Especially people like her. She scrolled through the spreadsheet one last time. The numbers still didn't sit right. Something about the Midwest acquisition felt inflated, padded in places that didn't need padding. She'd flagged it in a note attached to the file. Calm language. No accusations. Just questions. Her inbox chimed. A new calendar notification slid onto the screen. Meeting request, 2:30 p.m. Location, Executive Conference Room B. From Leonard Whitcomb. Danielle stared at it, her fingers hovering above the mouse. Leonard Whitcomb didn't do spontaneous meetings. His calendar was managed weeks in advance by an assistant who guarded his time like a fortress. And he certainly didn't call people in on Christmas Eve. If he needed something, he sent an email. If he was angry, he sent silence. Her chest tightened. She checked the invite details again as if they might change. They didn't. Conference Room B was on the same floor. Close enough to feel deliberate. Danielle glanced around the office. Empty chairs. Coats draped over cubicle walls like abandoned skins. Someone had left a half-empty mug by the printer, coffee gone cold. The fake Christmas tree near the elevators blinked unevenly, one string of lights clearly on its last breath. A paper wreath hung crooked above the security desk down the hall. It smelled faintly of pine cleaner and burnt coffee. Her phone buzzed again. She silenced it. Leonard's name sat at the top of the meeting request, clean and sharp. Founder. Geo. The man business magazines love to call relentless, visionary, unstoppable. The kind of man whose photo looked better in print than in real life. Danielle clicked accept. The calendar confirmed it with a soft chime that sounded too cheerful for the moment. She saved her work, shut down her computer, and slipped her notebook into her bag. The one she always carried. Habit. Insurance. Years of training told her to keep her own records. As she stood, her knee brushed the desk, rattling the framed photo. She steadied it and hesitated, then picked it up and slid it into her bag as well. Just in case. Her heels sounded too loud as she walked toward the hallway. Each step echoed, sharp and lonely. She passed Leonard's corner office, its door closed, the frosted glass glowing faintly from within. Somewhere inside, a man worth billions waited. Danielle slowed near the elevators, catching her reflection in the mirrored doors. She adjusted her sweater, smoothed the cuffs worn thin from years of use. She looked tired. Everyone did this time of year. If you've ever stayed late somewhere you weren't sure you were still wanted, you know the feeling that crept into her chest then. That quiet question. The one that doesn't ask out loud but never really goes away. She turned down the corridor toward Conference Room B. The door at the end of the hall was already closed. And for the first time that day, Danielle wondered if she would be walking back to her desk afterward, or not at all. Conference room B was colder than the rest of the floor. Danielle noticed it the moment she stepped inside, the kind of cold that seeped through fabric and settled in the bones. The long glass table reflected the city lights outside, pale and distorted by the snow still falling beyond the windows. The skyline looked distant from up here, like something happening to someone else. Leonard Whitcomb stood near the window with his back to her, hands clasped behind him. He didn't turn when the door closed. He didn't acknowledge her presence at all. That alone told her this wasn't a conversation. At the far end of the table sat a woman Danielle didn't recognize. Early 40s, neat bob, navy blazer. A leather folder rested in front of her, hands folded carefully on top. Char. Danielle felt it immediately, the way you feel a storm before the rain starts. "Have a seat," Leonard said, still facing the window. Danielle remained standing. "I don't have much time," she said. "My son's school." "This won't take long," Leonard replied. His voice was calm. Even. The kind of calm that came from never being questioned. Danielle glanced at the woman at the table. The woman met her eyes briefly, then looked down as if studying the grain of the wood. Danielle felt a tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with the cold. Leonard finally turned around. Up close, he looked exactly like he always did. Tailored suit, silver hair perfect, expression neutral to the point of being unreadable. If there was tension in the room, it didn't show on his face. "Please," he said, gesturing toward the chair. Danielle sat. The chair felt too low, forcing her to look slightly upward at him. It was a small thing. Deliberate, she suspected. "This is Elaine," Leonard said, nodding toward the woman. "She's here to ensure everything is handled properly." Elaine gave a tight smile. "Hello, Danielle." Danielle nodded back. Her heart thudded hard enough that she wondered if they could hear it. Leonard took his seat at the head of the table but didn't sit all the way back. He leaned forward, forearms resting on the glass, fingers interlaced. "We're making some organizational changes," he said. Danielle waited. "In the interest of efficiency," he continued, "certain roles are being consolidated." The words floated in the air, vague and polished. "And?" Danielle asked. Elaine slid the leather folder toward her. The motion was slow, careful, like handling something fragile. Danielle stared at the folder. She didn't touch it yet. Her eyes moved from the folder to Leonard's face, searching for something. Crack. A hint that this was some kind of test. "You're eliminating my position," Danielle said quietly. "Yes," Leonard replied. No hesitation. No apology. Danielle let out a short breath. It almost sounded like a laugh. "I'm the only senior analyst assigned to risk compliance on this floor. And your work will be redistributed," Leonard said. "We've assessed the impact." "You asked me to review the Midwest acquisition numbers," Danielle said. "I did exactly that." Leonard's jaw tightened just slightly. "This decision isn't about a single project." Danielle reached for the folder now. Her fingers trembled despite her effort to keep them steady. Inside were neatly arranged papers. Termination notice. Final pay details. A non-disclosure agreement clipped to the top. Effective immediately. No severance beyond the minimum required by law. Her vision blurred for a moment. She blinked it away. "You're doing this today," she said. "On Christmas Eve." Leonard folded his hands again. "Business timelines don't follow holidays." Elaine shifted in her chair. "Just barely." Danielle flipped through the pages, though she already knew what they would say. Each word felt heavier than the last, like it was pressing down on her chest. "This doesn't make sense," she said. "My performance reviews have been satisfactory," Leonard interrupted. "That's not in question." "Then what is?" Danielle asked. Silence stretched between them. Outside, a siren wailed somewhere far below, muffled by snow and glass. Leonard leaned back slightly. "Sometimes," he said, "it's not about what you do. It's about how well you align with the company's direction." Danielle felt heat rise in her face. "You told me accuracy mattered." "It does," Leonard said smoothly. "But loyalty matters too." Elaine's pen hovered over her notepad, unmoving. Danielle closed the folder. "Are you saying I'm not loyal?" she asked. "Because I asked questions?" Leonard's eyes sharpened. "I'm saying this conversation is over." He nodded toward the papers. "Sign." Danielle looked at the folder again, then at Leonard. For a moment, she considered standing up, walking out, refusing to give him that satisfaction. Then she thought of her son. Waiting. The snowstorm. Rent due in 2 weeks. Her hand moved almost on its own. As she picked up the pen, she noticed something she hadn't before. Her name typed neatly at the top of the termination letter, and beneath it, a date that wasn't today. It was from 3 weeks earlier. Danielle froze. She looked up at Leonard, her heart pounding louder than ever. "You planned this," she said softly. Leonard didn't respond. And that silence told her more than any answer could. Danielle stared at the date on the document as if it might rearrange itself under enough pressure. 3 weeks earlier. The room felt suddenly smaller, the glass walls closing in. She looked from the paper to Leonard, then to Elaine, who was now very focused on her notepad. "You said this was restructuring," Danielle said. Her voice sounded steady even to her own surprise. "But this was decided before I sent you those numbers." Leonard's expression didn't change. "Plans evolve." "So this meeting," Danielle continued, "this timing, it wasn't about efficiency. It was about convenience." Elaine shifted again, clearing her throat. "Danielle, if you have questions about the paperwork..." "I have questions about why I'm being removed after raising concerns," Danielle cut in. Leonard's eyes hardened. "Be careful," he said quietly. "You're implying misconduct." "I'm stating facts," Danielle replied. "The acquisition figures don't add up. I documented it. You asked me to." Leonard stood. The scrape of his chair against the floor echoed sharply in the room. He walked around the table slowly, deliberately, stopping behind Danielle's chair. She could feel his presence before she saw him, like a shadow blocking the light. "You were hired to analyze risk," he said. "Not to create it." Danielle clenched her jaw. "Ignoring inaccuracies creates risk." Leonard placed a hand on the back of her chair. Not aggressively. Casually. It made her skin crawl. "What creates risk," he said, "is when employees forget their place in the organization." Elaine's pen finally touched paper, scribbling something Danielle couldn't see. Leonard moved back to his seat. "You're being compensated according to policy. Your final paycheck will include unused vacation hours." "No severance," Danielle said. "That is correct." Danielle exhaled slowly. She felt like she was watching herself from outside her body, like this was happening to someone else. Someone who would wake up soon. She flipped to the non-disclosure agreement. "This says I can't discuss internal practices," she said. "With anyone." "That's standard," Leonard replied. "It also says I can't cooperate with investigations that might harm the company." Leonard met her gaze. "You won't need to." The implication settled heavily between them. Danielle closed the folder again. Her fingers pressed into the leather until her knuckles ached. "You're asking me to walk away quietly," she said. "I'm offering you a clean exit," Leonard corrected. "Many people would appreciate that." Danielle laughed then. Not loudly. Just a breath that escaped before she could stop it. "On Christmas Eve," she said. "That's generous." Leonard's mouth tightened. "Sign the papers." Elaine slid the pen closer. Danielle picked it up. The weight of it surprised her. It felt heavier than it should have been, like it carried more than ink. She thought of her son again. His winter coat that was already getting tight in the shoulders. The bike hidden in the hallway. The way he'd looked at her that morning and asked if she'd be home early. "Yes," she'd said. "I promise." Her signature went onto the page in smooth, practiced strokes. She'd signed her name on contracts, audits, compliance reports. This was just another line. When she finished, Elaine gathered the papers quickly, as if afraid Danielle might change her mind. Leonard didn't say thank you. "Security will escort you to collect your belongings," he said. "Your access has already been revoked." Danielle's head snapped up. "Already?" Leonard checked his watch. "Timing matters." Elaine stood, offering a small, rehearsed smile. I'm sorry it ended this way. Danielle looked at her. Really looked. Saw the tension in her jaw, the way her shoulders were slightly hunched like someone bracing for impact. So am I, Danielle said. The walk back through the office felt longer than before. A security guard she vaguely recognized waited near the elevators. He avoided her eyes as he followed her to her cubicle, standing a few steps back while she packed. Danielle moved slowly, deliberately. She didn't want to forget anything. The notebook, her mug, a stress ball shaped like a globe someone had given her as a joke years ago. She slid the framed photo into her bag, then paused, looking around the space she'd occupied for 5 years. The desk was already wiped clean, her computer dark and lifeless. Like she'd never been there at all. The guard cleared his throat. "Take your time," he said, not quite meeting her gaze. "Thank you," Danielle replied. At the elevators, she pressed the button and waited. The guard didn't step inside with her. Just nodded as the doors closed. The ride down was silent. Her reflection stared back at her, eyes a little too bright, face too still. In the lobby, the paper wreath sagged further to one side. Someone had taped a handwritten sign to the security desk that read "Happy Holidays." The exclamation point felt aggressive. Danielle stepped outside. The cold hit her immediately, sharp and unforgiving. Snow soaked into her shoes as she stood there, clutching the cardboard box the guard had handed her at the door. Behind her, the building rose tall and indifferent. Her phone rang. She answered without looking. "Baby," her mother's voice said, gentle and worried. "Where are you?" Danielle swallowed, her throat tight. "I'm coming," she said. I don't work there anymore." There was a pause on the line. Then, softly, "Come home." Danielle looked back at the glass doors one last time. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the shock and the cold, something else stirred. A question she wasn't ready to answer yet. The train ride home blurred past in streaks of gray and white. Danielle sat near the window, the cardboard box wedged between her boots, her coat still dusted with melting snow. The car was half full, people carrying shopping bags, gift boxes, plastic-wrapped poinsettias. Someone laughed a few seats down, the sound bright and careless. Danielle stared at her reflection in the dark glass. She didn't cry. Not yet. Her mind replayed the meeting over and over, each detail sharpening instead of fading. The date on the paperwork. Leonard's hand on the back of her chair. The word loyalty delivered like a verdict. By the time she stepped off the train, the sky had darkened completely. Streetlights glowed through the snowfall, halos of yellow and white. Her phone buzzed again, a text this time. "Mom, I picked him up. Take your time. We're here." Danielle typed back a thank you, then slipped the phone into her pocket without rereading it. The walk to her apartment felt longer than usual, every step heavy, like she was carrying more than the box in her arms. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of fried food and old carpet. The used bike leaned against the wall just inside her door, half hidden by a coat rack. She paused there, staring at it. The handlebars were slightly scratched. The bell didn't work unless you hit it just right. She set the box down slowly. Her son came out of the living room, socked feet sliding on the floor. "Mom?" He stopped short when he saw her face. "You're early," he said. "Did you get off work?" Danielle crouched in front of him, hands on his shoulders. He was warm. Solid. Real. "Yeah," she said. "I did." "Forever?" he asked, half joking. She smiled just enough. "For a little while." Her mother appeared behind him, eyes already scanning Danielle for answers. They shared a look that held too much understanding to need words. Dinner passed quietly. Danielle ate, though she barely tasted anything. She answered questions without giving details. Later, after her son went to bed, she sat alone at the kitchen table with the box open in front of her. Her notebook lay on top. She'd almost left it behind. Almost told herself it wasn't worth carrying anymore. Now she opened it without really deciding to. The pages were filled with her handwriting, tight, careful rows of numbers and notes. Dates. Margins circled in red. Small question marks where something didn't sit right. She flipped to the section on the Midwest acquisition. There was again. The same imbalance that had bothered her at work. projected revenues that assumed growth without infrastructure, costs that were rounded too cleanly, a consulting fee paid to a company with no visible staff. She pulled out her laptop and opened it. Danielle didn't log into any company systems. She didn't need to. Everything she'd written down was already here on paper. She typed the shell company's name into a public registry search. It took longer than it should have. When the results loaded, her pulse quickened. The company had been incorporated less than a year earlier. Registered address, a mailbox service in Delaware. Directors, 2 names that meant nothing to her and one that did. A holding firm. Leonard Whitcomb used 4 strategic investments. Danielle leaned back in her chair, heart pounding. She wasn't imagining it. She flipped through the notebook faster now, tracing the pattern she'd sensed but never fully articulated. Similar fees. Similar structures. Always just under thresholds that triggered automatic reviews. It was clever. Too clever to be accidental. Her phone buzzed on the table. An unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. Danielle Brooks, a man's voice said. Professional. Measured. This is Agent Samuel Harris with the Internal Revenue Service. Her breath caught. Yes. We're conducting a routine review, he said. Your name came up in relation to a consulting payment reported last year. We'd like to ask you a few questions. Danielle glanced at her open notebook. At the company name on her screen. I've never done consulting, she said slowly. Not last year. There was a pause on the line. That's what we need to clarify, the agent replied. It appears income was reported under your name that doesn't match your filings. Danielle felt the room tilt slightly. When would you like to meet? She asked. Soon, he said. The holidays complicate things, but early January should work. They hung up. Danielle sat there, unmoving, the silence pressing in around her. Outside, a car passed, tires hissing on slush. Somewhere in the building, a door slammed. Leonard's words echoed in her head. You won't need to cooperate with investigations. Her hands curled into fists. This wasn't just about being fired. Someone had taken her name and attached it to something dirty. Something deliberate. Danielle closed the notebook carefully as if sealing a promise inside it. She didn't know yet how far this would go. She didn't know who would believe her. But for the first time since walking out into the snow that afternoon, one thing became painfully clear. Leonard Whitcomb hadn't just ended her job. He had started something she couldn't ignore. January arrived without ceremony. The holiday decorations disappeared from windows and lobbies, replaced by gray slush and exhausted faces. Danielle returned to routines she didn't recognize anymore. Mornings still started early, but there was no office to rush to, no badge to clip onto her coat. Just her son's backpack by the door and a calendar that suddenly looked too empty. The IRS meeting was scheduled for the 2nd week of the month. In the days leading up to it, Danielle gathered everything she could think of. Bank statements, tax returns, old pay stubs. She organized them in neat folders, the way she always did when facing something she couldn't control. Order helped her breathe. At night, after her son fell asleep, she pulled out the notebook again. She told herself she was only reviewing it in case questions came up. That she wasn't looking for trouble. But trouble had a way of leaving fingerprints. The consulting payment reported under her name was small enough to seem harmless to anyone skimming a ledger. Too small to raise alarms on its own. But it matched exactly, down to the cents, the amount listed as an external advisory fee on one of the Midwest acquisitions. Someone hadn't just used her name. They'd used her work. Danielle's stomach twisted every time she thought about it. The IRS office downtown was quieter than she expected. Fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. A few chairs lined the wall, their vinyl seats cracked from years of use. Agent Harris greeted her with a firm handshake. He was younger than she'd imagined, maybe mid-30s, with tired eyes and a careful way of speaking. This is informal, he said as they sat down. We're just trying to understand discrepancies. Danielle slid the folders across the table. I didn't receive this income, she said. And I didn't authorize anyone to report it. Harris nodded, flipping through her documents. The issue, he said, is that the payment was reported as consulting work related to an acquisition you were assigned to internally. Danielle leaned forward. Assigned? She repeated. Not compensated. Harris looked up at her then, studying her face. Do you have reason to believe someone would report income in your name without your knowledge? Danielle hesitated. She thought of the NDA she'd signed, of Leonard's warning, of the date on the termination letter. I was terminated from my position shortly after raising concerns about that acquisition, she said carefully. Harris's pen paused. Concerns like what? He asked. Danielle took a breath. Irregularities. Numbers that didn't align with operational reality. Harris didn't interrupt. He let her talk. When the meeting ended, nothing was resolved. No accusations. No reassurances either. Just a promise that the review would continue. As Danielle stepped back outside into the cold, she felt exposed. Like she'd just walked out of a room where her future was being quietly weighed. The letter arrived 2 weeks later. Notice of extended audit. Her hands shook as she read it. They wanted more documentation. More clarification. The language was polite, but the implications were clear. This wasn't going away quickly. At the same time, job applications began coming back with firmer rejections. Some didn't give reasons at all. Others mentioned internal references. Danielle started to see the pattern. Leonard Whitcomb wasn't speaking her name publicly. He didn't need to. His influence moved in quieter ways. One afternoon, a former colleague called her from a blocked number. I probably shouldn't be doing this, the woman said quickly. But your name came up in a meeting. Danielle sat very still. In what way? They said you were difficult, the woman replied. Not a team player. That you didn't understand executive priorities. Danielle closed her eyes. Who said that? She asked, though she already knew. The call ended abruptly after that. Weeks turned into months. Danielle took short-term contract work where she could find it. Data cleanup. Compliance reviews for small firms that couldn't afford bigger names. The work was steady but modest. It paid bills. Barely. At night, she lay awake listening to the building settle around her, her mind running numbers the way it always had. Except now the numbers weren't spreadsheets. They were timelines. Scenarios. Risks. She began documenting everything. Dates of phone calls. Names. Exact wording when she could remember it. She didn't know what she was building yet, only that it felt dangerous not to. One evening, as she filed away another note, her son wandered into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes. Are you working? He asked. Just organizing, Danielle said, forcing a smile. He nodded, satisfied, and shuffled back to bed. Danielle stared at the closed door long after he was gone. Leonard had once told her loyalty mattered more than accuracy. Now, as the walls seemed to tighten around her life, she began to understand what he'd really meant. And the most unsettling thought of all crept in quietly, settling deep in her chest. If he was willing to do this to protect himself, how far would he be willing to go next? By spring, Danielle stopped counting rejection emails. They arrived at all hours, some automated, others written with just enough personalization to sting. We've decided to move forward with other candidates. At this time we're seeking a different fit. Your background is impressive, but... The word "but" did a lot of work. She learned to recognize the pause during phone screens. The moment when enthusiasm dipped, when voices cooled slightly after she mentioned Haverford Dynamics. Why did you leave? Recruiters asked, always casually. My position was eliminated, Danielle replied. The truth stripped to its safest shape. Sometimes there was a silence after that. Sometimes a follow-up. Was that part of the restructuring last December? Yes. And still the calls rarely moved forward. Danielle began to suspect what she couldn't prove. Leonard didn't need to lie outright. He only had to suggest. A raised eyebrow here. A carefully chosen word there. In certain circles, his opinion carried more weight than facts. Money tightened. Danielle cut expenses where she could. Streaming services first. Then weekend takeout. She postponed replacing her cracked phone screen. When the heating bill jumped unexpectedly one month, she sat at the kitchen table long after midnight, recalculating the budget again and again as if the numbers might change if she stared hard enough. Her mother offered help more often now. "I'm okay," Danielle insisted, even as envelopes piled up in the corner of the counter. Really? Some nights she believed it. Other nights she lay awake listening to the radiator hiss and knock, her thoughts spiraling. She replayed the IRS meeting. The questions that hadn't been asked yet. The ones she knew were coming. The audit dragged on. Each letter from the IRS was polite, precise, impersonal, and each one asked for more. More documentation, more explanation, more time. At one point, Agent Harris called her again. "We're still tracing the source of the reported income," he said. "It may take a while." "A while how long?" Danielle asked. "Months," he admitted. "Possibly longer." After the call, Danielle sat very still. Months meant uncertainty. Uncertainty meant employers hesitating. No company wanted to hire someone under federal review, even if the review wasn't her fault. She started saying yes to work she would have once turned down. A small logistics firm hired her to reconcile outdated compliance records. A nonprofit needed help preparing for an audit. The pay was modest, but the work was clean. Honest. She poured herself into it anyway. Word spread slowly. "She's thorough," one client told another. Almost obsessively so. Danielle didn't correct them. In late summer, she was reviewing expense reports for a regional transport company when something familiar caught her eye. A consulting fee that didn't align with deliverables. A vendor name that felt recycled. Her pulse quickened. She pulled the thread gently, checking public filings, then internal records the client had access to. The pattern wasn't identical, but it rhymed. Shell structures. Rounded numbers. Fees that hovered just below scrutiny thresholds. She flagged it for the client, carefully, the way she always did. 2 weeks later, the client called her back. "You were right," the CFO said. "We didn't even know where to start looking." Danielle hung up and sat back in her chair, heart racing, not with fear this time, but with something else. Recognition. This wasn't just about Leonard. This was bigger than him. A way of doing business that rewarded silence and punished scrutiny. The thought unsettled her. In the fall, another letter arrived from the IRS. This one was thinner, shorter. Her hands shook as she opened it. They acknowledged her cooperation. Noted inconsistencies in the reporting entity. Stated the review was ongoing, but that responsibility had not yet been assigned. Not yet. Danielle exhaled slowly. That night, she pulled out her notebook and added a new section. Not about Haverford. About patterns. She didn't know what she was building, only that she couldn't stop. The more she worked, the more she saw the same quiet shortcuts, the same blurred ethical lines. Always justified. Always rationalized. Leonard hadn't invented this world. He just mastered it. One evening, as she shut down her laptop, her son looked up from his homework. "Mom," he said, "why do you always write things down?" Danielle smiled faintly. "So I don't forget." He thought about that, then nodded. "That's smart." Later, alone again, Danielle stared at the notebook on the table. At the growing list of names, dates, structures. A realization settled in slowly, heavily. Losing her job hadn't ended her career. It had stripped away her protection. And as the evidence quietly accumulated, one question pressed closer than ever before. If the truth was this easy to find once you knew how to look, why was no one else looking at Leonard Whitcomb? The notebook began to feel heavier the longer Danielle carried it. Not because of its size, but because of what it represented. Every page held proof that she wasn't imagining things. That the unease she'd felt for years at Haverford hadn't been paranoia or overthinking. It had been pattern recognition. She stopped calling it her notebook in her head. It was her record. By winter, Danielle had developed a rhythm. Mornings were for client work. Afternoons for job applications she sent out more out of obligation than hope. Evenings, once her son was asleep, were for reviewing documents, her own notes, public filings, archived emails she'd legally retained. She worked at the small dining table, a single lamp casting a circle of light while the rest of the apartment stayed dark. Outside, snow scraped softly along the windows. The building creaked inside like it was tired too. She flipped to the earliest entries she'd made while still at Haverford. At the time they'd seemed minor. A discrepancy here. A delayed response there. Leonard had brushed them off with practiced ease. You're thinking too small, Danielle. Trust the strategy. Now, with distance, the notes read differently. She traced a line with her finger across one page, following arrows she'd drawn months before she was fired. Shell companies linked by overlapping directors. Consulting firms that existed mostly on paper. Payments routed through jurisdictions known for discretion. She opened her laptop and began recreating the structure digitally, mapping relationships the way she would for a client. Boxes, lines, dates. The picture that emerged made her chest tighten. This wasn't a one-off scheme tied to a single acquisition. It was a framework, reusable, adjustable, designed to move money quietly while maintaining plausible deniability. And Leonard Whitcomb sat at the center of it. Danielle leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. At work, she told herself it wasn't her place to question intent. She'd been hired to analyze risk, not assign blame. That distinction had felt important then. Now it felt naive. Her phone buzzed on the table. A voicemail notification. She pressed play. Danielle, it's Karen from Placement, the voice said, overly bright. I wanted to follow up. The client decided not to move forward. Nothing personal. Timing issues. Danielle deleted the message without responding. She returned to the notebook. One entry stopped her. It was dated 3 days before Leonard had asked her to finalize the Midwest numbers. She'd written it late, the ink slightly smudged where her hand must have rested. If these figures go through as is, responsibility will be diffuse. No single owner. Risk absorbed at the analyst level. She swallowed. Responsibility absorbed at the analyst level. She pulled up the IRS notice again, reading it more carefully than before. The language was careful, but one phrase caught her attention. Income reported in connection with advisory services. Advisory. Consulting. The same word Leonard had used casually in meetings when describing offloaded work. Danielle's breath came faster. She began cross-referencing dates. The reported consulting payment. The internal review timeline. Her own emails raising concerns. The overlap was too precise to be coincidence. Someone had taken her internal role and reframed it externally. Turned her salaried analysis into consulting services she'd never provided independently. And they'd done it after she'd raised red flags. Danielle closed her laptop slowly. A realization settled over her, heavy and cold. This wasn't just retaliation. It was insulation. If the numbers ever came under scrutiny, blame could travel downward. Land on someone expendable. Someone no longer employed. Someone already framed as difficult. Someone like her. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone. She didn't call Agent Harris. Not yet. Instead, she opened a new document and began writing. Not numbers this time. Names. Dates. Conversations she could recall word for word. Leonard's exact phrasing. Elaine's silence. The way the termination paperwork had been dated weeks earlier. She wrote until her wrist ached. When she finally stopped, the apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. She realized she'd been holding her breath. A soft knock came from the hallway. Danielle froze. The knock came again, gentle this time. She stood slowly, heart pounding, and moved toward the door. Through the peephole, she saw her neighbor from across the hall, an older man holding a misdelivered package. Relief washed through her so suddenly it made her knees weak. After she closed the door again, Danielle leaned against it for a long moment. She laughed under her breath. A short, shaky sound. This was what Leonard had taken from her. Not just her job. Her sense of safety. She returned to the table and gathered the notebook, the printed notices, the pages she'd just written. She stacked them neatly, aligning the edges. For the first time, she didn't shove them into a drawer. She placed them in a file box and labeled it carefully. Haverford, internal. She stared at the box, then added a second label beneath it. Do not discard. Danielle didn't know yet who would see this, or when. But she knew one thing with absolute clarity. If Leonard Whitcomb ever faced real scrutiny, This wouldn't start with a dramatic revelation or a public accusation. It would start exactly here, with the quiet evidence he'd assumed no one would ever bother to connect. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a grocery flyer and a credit card offer Danielle had no intention of opening. She recognized the envelope immediately. Plain. Official. The return address printed in neat black ink that didn't need decoration to feel heavy. Her hands paused mid-motion as she sorted the mail. For a moment she considered setting it aside, letting it sit unopened on the counter while she finished making dinner, pretending, just for a few more minutes, that her life wasn't being quietly examined by strangers with authority. Then her son called from the living room, asking if there was any more milk. Danielle opened the envelope. Notice of extended audit. The words jumped out first, bolded and unforgiving. She scanned the rest quickly, heart pounding harder with each line. Additional documentation required. Clarification of income sources. Review period expanded. No accusations. No reassurance. Just time. She folded the letter carefully and slid it back into the envelope, her movements slow and deliberate. She poured the milk, stirred the pasta, answered her son's questions about school as if nothing had changed. But something had. That night, after the dishes were done and the apartment settled into its usual quiet, Danielle sat at the table with the letter laid flat in front of her. Extended audit meant someone had found enough inconsistency to keep digging. And digging, she knew, could uncover anything. Even things planted intentionally. She pulled out the file box and opened it. The smell of paper and ink felt grounding. Real. She spread out the documents methodically, bank statements on one side, her notebook on the other, IRS letters stacked neatly at the top. This time she didn't just review. She reconstructed. She traced the timeline from the Midwest acquisition to her termination, then forward to the reported consulting payment. She added dates she hadn't considered before. Board meetings. Quarterly filings. The exact week Leonard had stopped responding to her emails. Her pen moved faster as connections sharpened. Someone hadn't simply used her name. They timed everything. Danielle leaned back, rubbing her temples. A dull ache had settled behind her eyes, the kind that came from thinking too hard for too long. She glanced at the clock. 1:37 a.m. Her phone buzzed suddenly, making her flinch. A number she didn't recognize. She hesitated, then answered. Ms. Brooks, a woman said. Come. Professional. This is Patricia Lynn from the Internal Revenue Service. I'm assisting with your case. Danielle straightened in her chair. Yes. We've identified discrepancies in the entity that reported income under your name, Lynn said. Specifically, the documentation provided doesn't match operational reality. Danielle closed her eyes briefly. Meaning? Meaning, Lynn continued, the consulting services described don't appear to exist in any functional sense. Danielle's grip tightened on the phone. So you believe I didn't do the work, she said. I believe, Lynn replied carefully, that someone reported work in your name that doesn't align with your employment history. Danielle swallowed. What happens now? We continue verifying responsibility, Lynn said. That takes time. After the call ended, Danielle sat in silence, phone still pressed to her ear. They were seeing it. Not fully. Not clearly yet. But the shape of it. Relief flickered, brief and dangerous. She pushed it away. Extended audits didn't just threaten finances. They threatened credibility. They made people cautious. Employers cautious. Banks cautious. Everyone cautious. She gathered the papers again, stacking them with renewed precision. The next few weeks passed in a fog of paperwork and waiting. Requests arrived. Danielle responded promptly, attaching explanations, supporting documents, timelines she'd prepared down to the hour. She heard nothing back. The quiet was worse than bad news. One afternoon, as she sat reviewing a client's compliance report, her phone rang again. Agent Harris this time. We're expanding the scope, he said without preamble. Danielle's stomach dropped. Expanding how? There are indications the reporting entity may have misattributed income to multiple individuals, he said. Not just you. Danielle closed her eyes slowly. So I'm not the only one, she said. No, Harris replied. But you appear to be the only one who questioned the underlying transaction internally. The words settled heavily between them. When the call ended, Danielle stared at the wall for a long moment. Leonard hadn't chosen her randomly. He'd chosen her because she'd noticed, because she'd asked, because she'd written things down. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed listening to the wind scrape against the building, her mind cycling through possibilities. If this widened, people would talk. Names would surface. Reputations would shift. And Leonard Whitcomb would know. She imagined him receiving a call. An email. A quiet inquiry that hinted at scrutiny. She imagined his reaction. Not panic, but calculation. Men like Leonard didn't collapse when questioned. They adapted. As dawn crept through the curtains, Danielle sat up, a single thought crystallizing with unsettling clarity. The audit wasn't just a threat to her anymore. It was a warning shot. And whatever Leonard Whitcomb did next would determine how dangerous this was about to become. The first sign that something had shifted came not as a letter or a call, but as silence that felt deliberate. Weeks passed after Agent Harris mentioned expanding the scope of the audit. Danielle kept sending documents, kept answering questions, kept her tone measured and cooperative. But the responses slowed. Emails that once took days now took weeks. Phone calls went unanswered. It felt less like bureaucracy and more like hesitation. Someone, somewhere, was deciding how dangerous this had become. Danielle noticed the change in other places too. A contract she was finalizing suddenly stalled without explanation. A client she'd worked with twice before postponed their next engagement, citing internal uncertainty. Even her bank requested updated documentation for a routine account review. The audit was no longer a private inconvenience. It was following her. One afternoon, she received an encrypted email link from the IRS, granting her temporary access to a document summary. It wasn't supposed to include details yet, just a status overview. But buried in the metadata was a reference number she recognized. The Shell Company. The same one tied to the Midwest acquisition. Danielle's pulse quickened as she cross-checked it against her records. The reporting entity had submitted revised documentation, amended forms meant to clarify the consulting payment. Clarify was a generous word. The revisions shifted responsibility. Not upward. Sideways. The consulting work, according to the new narrative, had been subcontracted through an intermediary firm. That firm, in turn, claimed Danielle had been an independent contributor, transitioning out of employment. Danielle stared at the screen, disbelief tightening her chest. They were rewriting history. She pulled up her termination paperwork again, scanning for dates. The revised filings placed the consulting payment during a window when she was technically still employed, but marked internally as pending separation. It was subtle, almost elegant. Enough ambiguity to confuse regulators. Enough distance to protect the top. Danielle felt a cold clarity settle in. This wasn't damage control. It was escalation. She picked up her phone and called Patricia Lynn directly. It went to voicemail. "Patricia, this is Danielle Brooks," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I've reviewed the amended filings. They misrepresent my role. This is not clarification, it's fabrication." She hung up and immediately called Agent Harris. He answered on the third ring. "They changed the paperwork," Danielle said without preamble. "They're shifting responsibility to an intermediary and implying I worked independently during my termination window." There was a pause. "Yes," Harris said finally. "We saw that." "And?" Danielle asked. "And," he continued carefully, "it suggests coordination." Danielle closed her eyes. "Meaning someone is actively trying to protect themselves," she said. "Yes." She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. "Then why does it feel like this is stalling?" Harris sighed. "Because proving intent takes time. And resources. And cooperation." "From who?" Danielle asked. "From people who don't want to cooperate," he replied. After the call, Danielle sat in silence, the hum of her laptop the only sound in the room. Leonard Whitcomb was responding. Not publicly. Not clumsily. Precisely. She thought back to his office. The way he'd spoken about loyalty. The ease with which he'd dismissed accuracy as a secondary concern. This was his real talent. Not vision. Containment. That evening, Danielle pulled out the file box again, but this time she added a new folder. Amended filings. She printed the revised documents and spread them across the table, marking inconsistencies with a red pen. Language that contradicted internal emails. Timelines that didn't align with access logs she still had copies of. She wasn't supposed to have those logs anymore. But they existed. She paused, pen hovering as a thought formed slowly and dangerously. Leonard wasn't just trying to bury the truth. He was confident he could. That confidence came from experience. From having done this before. Danielle stood and walked to the window looking out at the city lights below. Somewhere out there, Leonard Whitcomb was likely sitting in a warm office or a quiet home, reviewing reports, making calls, adjusting strategies. He didn't see her as a threat. He saw her as a problem to be managed. That assumption tightened something in her chest. Not fear, but resolve. She returned to the table and opened a new document. This one wasn't for the IRS. Was for herself. A map of leverage points. Of people who might talk if approached the right way. Of former employees who'd left quietly, carrying their own unanswered questions. She began listing names she remembered from Haverford. Managers who'd been pushed out. Analysts who'd transferred abruptly. People who'd gone silent after raising concerns. The list grew faster than she expected. Danielle set the pen down slowly. Leonard's revised filings had done something unexpected. They'd confirmed what she'd suspected all along. He was afraid of patterns. And if that was true, then the next move wasn't about defending herself anymore. It was about understanding just how many people had been caught in the same web. Her phone buzzed softly on the table. A new email notification. Sender, unknown. Subject line, you're not wrong. Danielle stared at the screen, her breath catching. Then she clicked it open. Danielle didn't open the email right away. She stared at the subject line, you're not wrong, as if it might change if she waited long enough. Her cursor hovered over it, hand steady but heart racing. Messages from unknown senders rarely meant anything good, especially now. She checked the sender address. A generic account. No name. She exhaled slowly and clicked. I worked under Leonard for 6 years. I saw what happened to you. I didn't say anything then. I should have. If you're willing to listen, I can explain how the numbers were moved and why you were singled out. Danielle felt a chill run through her arms. She reread the message twice, then a third time, absorbing each line carefully. No threats. No demands. Just an admission laced with guilt. She typed a response, deleted it, then typed again. I'm listening, she finally wrote. But I need to understand your position first. The reply came faster than she expected. I left Haverford 3 years ago. Voluntary separation. That's what they called it. We can talk. But not by email. Danielle leaned back in her chair, fingers pressed together. This was the moment she'd been inching toward without fully acknowledging it. People were starting to surface. She agreed to a call the next evening. All day, she moved through her routines with a quiet tension coiled in her chest. She worked through client reports, picked her son up from school, made dinner, answered questions about homework, smiled when she was supposed to, but her thoughts stayed fixed on the call. At 8 p.m. sharp, her phone rang. This is Daniel, the man said after she answered. His voice was low, measured, tired. I was a senior manager in acquisitions. Danielle said nothing, letting the silence do its work. I reviewed the Midwest deal, Daniel continued. Not officially. Off the books. Her grip tightened on the phone. Leonard had a separate review track, he said. For people he trusted. Or thought he could control. And you? Danielle asked. I was useful, Daniel replied. Until I wasn't. He explained how consulting fees were used to smooth over gaps. How shell entities absorbed losses that would have raised questions if reported directly. How analysts who asked too many questions were reassigned or removed. And when someone needed to be a buffer, Daniel said, they picked someone credible, someone careful, someone whose objections were already documented. Danielle closed her eyes. They used me, she said. Yes, Daniel replied softly. And when you didn't fall in line, you became convenient. The call lasted over an hour. Daniel didn't exaggerate. He didn't speculate. He spoke in specifics. Dates, processes, internal language that matched Danielle's own experience too closely to be coincidence. When they hung up, Danielle sat in the darkened kitchen, phone still warm in her hand. She wasn't alone in this. That knowledge brought no comfort, only responsibility. Over the next few weeks, Danielle made a conscious choice. She stopped chasing immediate vindication, stopped pushing the IRS for answers they weren't ready to give. Instead, she focused on something quieter, slower: preparation. She enrolled in night classes at the community college: corporate governance, forensic accounting, regulatory law. She told herself it was for professional development, for future opportunities. But in truth, she was sharpening tools. During the day, she continued taking contract work, choosing clients carefully. Companies that needed deep compliance reviews. Organizations willing to let her look under the hood. She listened more than she spoke. People filled silences when given space. A logistics director complained about pressure to backdate invoices. A junior accountant mentioned being told not to ask where certain fees went. A compliance officer admitted audits were sometimes guided. Danielle documented everything. Not accusations. Patterns. At night, she studied case law. Learned how investigations actually unfolded. Where they stalled. Why they failed. She learned how evidence could be dismissed, not because it was wrong but because it was incomplete. She wasn't building a case yet. She was building credibility. Months passed. Her firm began to take shape without her quite naming it. Clients referred her to others. She's thorough, they said. She doesn't miss things. Danielle smiled at that. She missed plenty. She just didn't ignore what she found. Occasionally, another message arrived. A former employee. A quiet admission. A shared frustration. Some were too afraid to talk further. Others offered fragments. Nothing actionable on its own. Danielle collected them anyway. One evening, as she reviewed notes from a recent client engagement, her son leaned over her shoulder. "You always look serious when you work," he said. She smiled faintly. "That's because details matter." He nodded as if filing that away for later. After he went to bed, Danielle returned to her notes. To the growing web of connections. To the realization that what Leonard Whitcomb had built wasn't just a company. It was a system designed to survive scrutiny. And systems didn't collapse from one complaint or one audit. They collapsed when someone understood them well enough to apply pressure in the right places. Danielle closed her laptop and looked at the file box on the shelf. She wasn't chasing revenge. She was choosing patience. And somewhere she knew Leonard was still confident the worst had passed. That confidence, she suspected, was going to cost him far more than he realized. The first time Danielle saw Leonard Whitcomb again, he didn't recognize her. It was a financial ethics conference in Chicago, the kind with neutral carpeting, lukewarm coffee, and speakers who talked about transparency while avoiding specifics. Danielle had been invited as an independent consultant to sit on a compliance panel. Leonard was there as a keynote sponsor. 10 years hadn't been kind to him, though not in ways most people would notice. His hair was thinner. His smile tighter. The ease he once carried had hardened into something practiced. Danielle watched from across the ballroom as he shook hands and laughed, surrounded by executives who leaned in when he spoke. The sight of him sent a brief, sharp pulse through her chest. Not anger exactly, but memory. Christmas Eve. The envelope. The way he hadn't stood up when he fired her. She turned her attention back to her notes. She hadn't come here for him. After her panel ended, she stepped away toward a quieter corridor lined with sponsor booths. She felt it before she heard it, someone watching her. Danielle Brooks. She turned. Leonard stood a few feet away, brow slightly furrowed, as if the name had triggered a half-forgotten file in his mind. "Yes," she said evenly. A pause stretched between them. Then his face softened into something resembling recognition. "Well," he said, smiling faintly, "this is unexpected." "Is it?" Danielle asked. He chuckled, the sound low and controlled. I heard you were consulting now. Compliance work, right? She nodded. Among other things. Leonard glanced around, lowering his voice. I have to say, I always knew you'd land on your feet. You were meticulous. Sometimes too meticulous. There it was. Not an apology. Not regret. A compliment sharpened into a warning. I learned to be, Danielle replied. Leonard studied her for a moment longer than necessary. If you're ever interested in coming back into the fold, he said casually, Haverford is always open to talent. Danielle held his gaze. I don't think that would be a good fit. He smiled again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. Fair enough. He walked away without another word. Danielle stood still, heart steady, hands calm at her sides. The encounter had confirmed something she'd suspected for a while. Leonard didn't see her as a threat. He saw her as a footnote that had refused to fade. That night, in her hotel room, Danielle reviewed the day's conversations. She'd met 2 compliance officers who spoke in careful half-truths. A junior executive who asked too many questions about her work. And one man who hadn't said much at all, but had slipped her a card with no title, just a number. She dialed it the next morning. I wasn't sure you'd call, the man said after introducing himself as Eric. He worked in internal controls at a regional bank, one Haverford used regularly. I don't ignore loose threats, Danielle replied. Eric hesitated, then spoke. I've seen flag transactions rerouted. Not illegal on their own, but repetitive, patterned. Danielle felt that familiar tightening in her chest. Do they involve consulting entities? She asked. Yes, Eric said quietly. And shell partnerships. Always just within tolerance. She thanked him and hung up, her mind already mapping the overlap. Over the next year, Danielle's firm grew steadily. Not explosively. She avoided that. She chose clients who valued discretion and accuracy. She hired slowly. Trained carefully. She became known for one thing above all else. If she said something was wrong, she could explain why. Regulators began requesting her assessments. Not officially at first. Informal consultations. Hypotheticals. Danielle answered honestly, always sticking to facts. Always documented. She never mentioned Leonard. She didn't need to. The second twist came quietly. A subpoena arrived, not for her but for records she'd prepared years earlier during her time at Haverford. The IRS had reopened a thread that had never been fully closed. Agent Harris called her that afternoon. We have corroboration, he said. Multiple sources, including internal banking controls. Danielle closed her eyes briefly. And Leonard? She asked. He's lawyered up, Harris replied. Which tells us something. That evening, Danielle sat alone in her office long after everyone else had gone home. She pulled out her original termination letter, edges worn now. She placed it beside a recent client contract bearing her firm's name. 10 years apart. Same woman. Different leverage. Her phone buzzed again. A message from Daniel, the former acquisitions manager. They're nervous. Meetings behind closed doors. Files being moved. Danielle typed back a single line. Good. She looked out the window at the city lights, steady and indifferent. Leonard had built his world on control, on the assumption that people would stay silent, grateful just to survive. He had never accounted for memory, or patience, or the quiet way pressure builds when every exit is watched. Somewhere she knew he was starting to realize that the past he'd buried hadn't stayed buried at all. And this time it wasn't coming back as a complaint. It was coming back as a record. The subpoena changed the temperature of everything. It didn't arrive with drama. No agents at the door. No urgent calls in the middle of the night. Just a thick envelope delivered to Danielle's office, addressed to her firm, requesting records tied to a narrow window of time, transactions she had reviewed during her final year at Haverford. The specificity unsettled her. This wasn't fishing. Someone knew exactly where to look. Danielle read the document twice, then once more aloud, listening for what wasn't said. The request focused on process, not conclusions. Draft. Internal notes. Early objections. The kinds of materials most companies assumed would never resurface. She locked the office door and pulled the old archive box from the bottom shelf. The cardboard was soft at the corners now, the label faded. She set it on the table and opened it slowly. Inside were versions of herself. Printed emails with margin notes. Meeting summaries she'd written, just in case. Spreadsheets annotated with questions no one had answered. She remembered the nights she'd stayed late, not out of ambition but unease. The feeling that something was wrong, even if she couldn't yet prove it. She organized everything carefully. Scanned originals. Logged timestamps. Added context where memory still served her. By the time she finished, the sun had dipped below the skyline. Her phone buzzed. Agent Harris. They moved faster than I expected, he said after she answered. Which tells me they're worried. About what? Danielle asked. About exposure, he replied. And about you. She felt a faint tightening in her chest. Why me now? Because your records show intent, Harris said. Not just what happened but what people were told, and when. After the call, Danielle sat quietly, letting the weight of it settle. Intent changed everything. Errors could be explained. Patterns could be dismissed. But intent suggested choice. And choice suggested responsibility. Over the next few weeks, she noticed subtle shifts. A longtime client paused a renewal, citing external pressure. A speaking engagement was quietly canceled. An unfamiliar car idled near her office one afternoon longer than necessary. Nothing overt. Just reminders. Daniel called her late one evening. They're cleaning house, he said. 2 directors gone. Quietly. Severance packages. Leonard? Danielle asked. Still standing, Daniel replied. But tense. He's not used to uncertainty. Danielle pictured Leonard pacing his office, reviewing reports, recalculating risks. For the first time, the variables were no longer fully under his control. Another message came, this one from Eric at the bank. They're trying to reclassify older transactions, he wrote. Backdate policy changes. It won't hold. Danielle forwarded the message to Harris without comment. She wasn't coordinating. She was observing. Then came the first real crack. A former Haverford compliance officer agreed to speak, officially, not anonymously. She'd been on medical leave for months, long enough, Danielle suspected, to weigh the cost of silence against the cost of speaking. Her statement didn't mention Leonard by name. It didn't need to. It described pressure from executive leadership. Instructions to close reviews prematurely. Language used to discourage escalation. Danielle read the transcript late one night, recognizing phrases she'd heard herself. Strategic tolerance. Contextual flexibility. Commercial necessity. Words designed to soften the truth until it bent. The following week, Haverford's board announced Leonard would be temporarily stepping back from daily operations pending an internal review. The news broke quietly. A single paragraph buried in a financial newsletter. But the effect was immediate. Phones rang. Emails multiplied. People who had been hesitant now sounded relieved. Danielle didn't celebrate. She waited. Experience had taught her that systems like this didn't fall all at once. They resisted, adjusted, tried to sacrifice parts to save the whole. She focused on her work, on her son's school projects, on keeping her voice steady when reporters began calling, not to accuse but to ask for background. She declined every interview. That restraint unsettled people more than outrage ever could. Then one afternoon, a courier arrived with a document addressed to her personally. No return address. Inside was a photocopy of an internal memo she'd never seen before. Leonard's handwriting filled the margins. Next to her name, circled in blue ink, were 3 words. Too principled. Danielle felt the air leave her lungs. This wasn't strategy. It was premeditation. She scanned the rest of the page. Notes about optics. About timing. About how removing her would simplify alignment. The date at the top stopped her cold. December 12th. 12 days before Christmas. Her hands trembled as she placed the memo on the table. Leonard hadn't fired her impulsively. He had planned it. And now someone wanted her to know. Her phone rang. Agent Harris again. "We just got something," he said, his tone different this time, sharper. "And I think you should sit down." Danielle was already seated. "What is it?" she asked. "A cooperating witness," Harris replied. From inside Leonard's circle. Danielle closed her eyes slowly. Because if Leonard's own people were starting to talk, then this was no longer about audits or compliance. It was about accountability. And the ground beneath him was finally starting to give way. The cooperating witness didn't come forward with anger. That was what unsettled Danielle most. When Agent Harris arranged the interview, he warned her not to expect a dramatic confession. "This person isn't here to burn everything down," he said. "They're here to protect themselves." The meeting took place in a quiet federal building outside the city. No signage. No waiting room chatter. Just beige walls and the low hum of air conditioning. Danielle sat at the far end of the table, hands folded, posture calm. Across from her sat a woman in her late 50s, hair pulled back tightly, glasses perched low on her nose. She introduced herself as Lorraine Mercer, former executive assistant to Leonard Whitcomb. For 22 years. "I handled his calendar, his correspondence, his internal memos," Lorraine said evenly. "If something happened in that company, I knew about it before most executives did." Danielle didn't interrupt. Lorraine adjusted her glasses. "I'm not proud of everything I ignored. But I wasn't naive either. I knew which documents to file and which ones never made it to the system." She slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of emails Danielle had never seen. Internal threads marked verbal follow-up only. Calendar entries scrubbed after the fact. Notes from meetings that officially never happened. And names. More than Danielle expected. This wasn't just Leonard, Lorraine said. But he was the center. Everything moved through him. Danielle's eyes stopped on one line. Christmas Eve terminations. Optics managed individually. Her throat tightened. Lorraine followed her gaze. "That was his phrase," she said quietly. He believed timing softened resistance. People were distracted. Focused elsewhere. Danielle remembered walking out of that office with a cardboard box while holiday music played faintly through the building speakers. Optics managed. "Why come forward now?" Danielle asked. Lorraine didn't answer immediately. She folded her hands, knuckles whitening slightly. "He let me go last year," she said. "No severance. No explanation. Just, done." Pause. "I gave him my loyalty," she continued. "He gave me distance." Agent Harris leaned forward. "And the memo?" he asked. Lorraine nodded. "I kept copies. Insurance, I suppose. I never thought I'd use them." Danielle felt a strange pull in her chest. Not satisfaction, not pity. Something closer to recognition. The interview lasted 3 hours. By the end, the narrative was no longer fragmented. It had shape, structure, intent. Leonard Whitcomb hadn't merely reacted to threats. He'd anticipated them. People weren't removed for mistakes. They were removed for friction. For asking questions that slowed momentum. For refusing to smooth edges that needed to stay sharp. Danielle was one of several. She was just the one who hadn't disappeared. Outside the building, the sky had darkened. Danielle stood on the steps for a moment, breathing in the cold air. Harris joined her. "This changes things," he said. "Yes," Danielle replied. "But not in the way people think." "How so?" "They'll try to narrow it," she said. "Make it about Leonard alone. Sacrifice him to preserve the rest." Harris nodded slowly. "That's already happening." In the weeks that followed, the shift became visible. Haverford's board announced a formal investigation. Leonard's access was revoked. His name disappeared from internal communications. Press releases spoke of isolated leadership failures. Isolated. Danielle watched the language carefully. Meanwhile, subpoenas expanded. Not outward, but downward. Mid-level executives. Legal advisors. Consultants. The system was being mapped from the inside. One evening, Danielle received a call from a number she didn't recognize. She answered cautiously. "Danielle," Leonard's voice said. Her heart stuttered once, then steadied. "I was told not to contact you," he continued, sounding almost conversational. But I wanted to speak directly. She said nothing. I hear you've been helpful, he said. I hope you understand how complicated things became. There was again. Complicated. You planned my termination, Danielle said quietly. 12 days before Christmas. Silence stretched across the line. That memo shouldn't exist, Leonard said finally. But it does, Danielle replied. Just like the patterns. Just like the people. He exhaled sharply. You don't gain anything from this, he said. Dragging it out won't change what happened. Danielle closed her eyes briefly. You're wrong, she said. It already has. She hung up before he could respond. That night she couldn't sleep. Not from fear, but from the weight of what was coming next. Because exposure wasn't the end. It was the beginning of consequences. And Leonard, for all his control and calculation, was about to learn something he'd never truly understood. Silence only protected you when everyone agreed to keep it. That agreement was breaking. And once it broke, it didn't stop at one name. The indictment didn't arrive with sirens or headlines. It came the way most irreversible things did, quietly on a Tuesday morning, buried beneath market updates and weather alerts. Danielle saw it first on her phone while standing in line for coffee. Former Haverford CEO charged in federal financial crimes probe. She didn't open the article right away. She paid for her coffee, nodded to the barista, stepped aside. Only then did she read. Wire fraud. Conspiracy. Obstruction. Leonard Whitcomb's name appeared 6 times in the first 3 paragraphs. Danielle felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief, not triumph. Something closer to gravity shifting. A long-held weight finally acknowledged by the world around it. By noon, her phone was ringing non-stop. Reporters. Former colleagues. People she barely remembered, all suddenly eager to reconnect. She let most calls go to voicemail. The few she answered were brief, factual, restrained. I can't comment on an active case. I'm cooperating fully. No, I don't feel vindicated. That last one surprised even her. Vindication suggested an ending. This wasn't that. In the days that followed, details emerged slowly. How funds had been routed. How oversight had been circumvented. How Leonard had approved structures designed to confuse rather than clarify. What surprised the public most wasn't the complexity. It was the duration. This hadn't been a momentary lapse or a single bad deal. It had been a method refined over years. And Leonard hadn't acted alone. That became clear when a second indictment followed. Then a third. Danielle watched from a distance as familiar names appeared, each accompanied by phrases like former executive or senior advisor. People who had once commanded rooms now reduced to summaries. She wasn't listed. Not as a defendant. Not as a co-conspirator. She appeared only once in a footnote. Early internal objections raised by a former financial analyst. That footnote mattered more than any headline. Agent Harris called that evening. He's negotiating, Harris said. Trying to minimize exposure. By offering who? Danielle asked. Everyone he can, Harris replied. Including the board. Danielle sat at her desk, fingers resting lightly on the wood. And the company? Under review, Harris said. There's talk of restructuring. Asset liquidation. Or acquisition, Danielle said quietly. There was a pause on the line. That's perceptive, Harris said. After the call, Danielle opened a file she'd been building for months. Not evidence. Not complaints. Valuations. Haverford's public image was battered, but its core assets were still strong. Infrastructure. Client networks. Intellectual property. And debt. A lot of it. Over the next year, Danielle moved carefully. She didn't announce plans or court attention. She partnered with a private equity group known for conservative takeovers and long-term restructuring. They valued her not for her story but her insight. She knows where the rot is, one partner said during a meeting. And where it isn't. Danielle insisted on conditions. No leadership from the previous regime. Full transparency clauses. Independent oversight. They agreed. Negotiations stretched on. Regulators scrutinized every step. Public opinion fluctuated between skepticism and curiosity. And Leonard? Leonard watched from a holding cell awaiting trial. He attempted to intervene once, through attorneys. Claimed conflict of interest. Accused Danielle of vendetta. The motion was denied. Cause and effect. The acquisition finalized 18 months later. Haverford Financial Group was dissolved and reconstituted under a new name. New board. New leadership. Danielle Brooks was named majority stakeholder and interim chair. The announcement didn't mention her termination. Or Christmas Eve. Or Leonard. It didn't need to. On her first day in the building, Danielle stood alone in the lobby before anyone else arrived. The same marble floors. The same echoing quiet. She walked to the elevator and pressed the button. As the doors slid open, she caught her reflection in the mirrored surface. Older. Calmer. Sharper around the eyes. She rode to the top floor. Leonard's old office had been stripped down. New furniture. Neutral colors. The view unchanged. She stood by the window for a long moment, watching the city move below. Ownership didn't feel like victory. It felt like responsibility. Her assistant knocked lightly. "Miss Brooks," she said. "The board is ready." Danielle nodded and turned from the window. As she walked toward the conference room, she passed a framed statement mounted on the wall. New company values drafted deliberately. Transparency. Accountability. Dissent without punishment. She paused briefly, then continued on. Somewhere in a federal courtroom, Leonard Whitcomb was preparing to argue his case. To explain. To reframe. Danielle had no interest in watching. The story had already moved past him. And for the first time in a decade, she wasn't reacting to what had been taken from her. She was deciding what would be built next. But the consequences, personal, public, and legal, were far from finished. And the final reckoning would not be delivered by a judge alone. The trial began in early spring, when the city was still undecided about the season. Rain clung to sidewalks. Trees hesitated between bare branches and green. Everything felt suspended, waiting. Danielle did not attend the first day. She followed the proceedings through transcripts and late-night summaries, reading the language carefully. Leonard Whitcomb sat at the defense table in tailored suits that no longer fit the room. The prosecution laid out timelines. Emails. Financial flows that once looked like noise but now formed a deliberate pattern. When Danielle was formally called as a witness, she did attend. Not out of obligation. Out of clarity. She arrived early, took her seat, and waited. The courtroom smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant. When Leonard entered, their eyes met for a fraction of a second. He looked smaller. Not physically, he was still tall, still composed, but diminished by context. Power stripped of its environment always looked fragile. Danielle took the stand mid-morning. She answered questions simply. Precisely. She described her role, her objections, her termination. She referenced documents without dramatizing them. When asked how it felt to be dismissed days before Christmas, she didn't embellish. "I felt confused," she said, "and concerned. Because the issues I'd raised hadn't been resolved." The defense tried to provoke emotion. They asked about resentment. About ambition. About her later acquisition of the company. Danielle met each question with steadiness. "My later involvement doesn't change what I observed at the time," she said. "It only gave me perspective on its scale." Leonard avoided looking at her. By the third week, cracks appeared in the defense's narrative. Former executives contradicted one another. Timelines overlapped poorly. Lorraine Mercer's testimony, measured, meticulous, landed hardest. When she read Leonard's handwritten notes aloud, the courtroom went silent. Too principled. Danielle felt a quiet ache in her chest. Not pain, but recognition. The verdict came on a Friday afternoon. Guilty on multiple counts. Leonard Whitcomb was remanded into custody pending sentencing. Danielle didn't stay for the press reaction. She left through a side exit and walked 3 blocks before calling her son's school to confirm pickup. Life didn't pause for closure. Weeks later, the sentencing hearing took place. Leonard received a lengthy prison term. Appeals were promised. Statements were made. Danielle watched none of it. Her focus had shifted. As chair of the newly formed firm, she faced resistance, not from regulators but from culture. Employees wary of change. Partners uneasy about transparency. Systems accustomed to quiet shortcuts. She addressed them directly. "We won't be fast," she told the board during one tense meeting. "We'll be accurate. If that costs us growth, so be it." Some resigned. Others stayed. The ones who stayed worked harder than anyone expected. Slowly the company changed. Compliance reviews became collaborative instead of performative. Internal objections were logged, discussed, resolved, or escalated without consequence. Danielle instituted one policy that raised eyebrows. Anonymous dissent would be reviewed monthly by leadership. Not to identify critics. To listen. One evening, long after most employees had gone home, Danielle sat alone in the conference room, reviewing reports. The city outside glowed softly. Her phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. "He asked about you today." Danielle typed back after a moment. "What did you say?" "Nothing," Daniel replied. "He already knows." She set the phone down. Leonard's downfall had not come from her anger or ambition. It had come from his certainty that people would stay quiet forever. She gathered her things and stood. As she turned off the lights, she glanced once more at the values on the wall. Dissent without punishment. She smiled faintly. Justice, she had learned, wasn't loud. It was patient. And it had a long memory. The first letter arrived 3 months after Leonard Whitcomb was transferred to a federal facility in Pennsylvania. It wasn't addressed to Danielle Brooks, chairwoman or majority stakeholder. It was addressed to Danielle Brooks, former employee. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Precise. Controlled. Slanted just enough to look personal. She didn't open it at first. She placed it on her desk and continued reading the quarterly compliance report in front of her. Numbers steadied her more than words ever had. Only when the office emptied and the building settled into its nighttime hush did she slit the envelope open. "Danielle, I've had time to think. More time than I ever allowed myself before." She read slowly. Leonard didn't apologize. He explained. He wrote about pressure, about expectations, about the weight of steering a company that had grown too fast for its own systems. He framed his choices as necessary corrections. Pragmatism mistaken for cruelty. When he mentioned her, it was careful. "You were competent. Ethical." That combination was difficult in an environment built on speed. Difficult. Not wrong. Not unjustly treated. Just inconvenient. Danielle folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. She didn't feel angry. Or tempted to respond. What unsettled her was how familiar the tone was. Leonard was still managing risk. Still shaping narrative. Prison had changed his surroundings, not his instincts. Over the following weeks, more letters came. Some from Leonard. Others from people she didn't know. Former employees, distant associates, even one shareholder. The messages shared a common theme. Regret, expressed without accountability. Fear disguised as reflection. One letter, however, stood apart. It came from Lorraine Mercer. "I testified because I needed to live with myself," Lorraine wrote. "But I also wanted you to know something. Leonard always believed systems outlast people. He never understood that memory does too." Danielle read that line twice. At work, the challenges intensified. A regulatory review flagged legacy accounts that predated the acquisition. Closing them would cost millions. Keeping them open would compromise everything Danielle had rebuilt. The board was split. "This could destabilize us," one director argued. "We've already paid enough." Danielle listened, then spoke quietly. "We're not paying for the past," she said. "We're deciding how much it costs to repeat it." The accounts were closed. The company's stock dipped, then stabilized. Employees began to notice something unexpected. Problems surfaced earlier. Losses were smaller. Trust, slow and unglamorous, started to grow. One afternoon, Danielle received an email from a junior analyst. "I raised a concern in my department today," it read. "No one shut me down. That's new here." She saved the message. At home, her son was taller than she remembered, his voice deeper, his questions sharper. "Why did people do bad things at your old job?" he asked one night over dinner. Danielle considered her answer carefully. "Most of them didn't think they were doing bad things," she said. They thought they were protecting something. Were they? He asked. She shook her head. They were protecting themselves. He nodded, absorbing that quietly. Later that week, Danielle received notice of Leonard's appeal filing. The language was aggressive, accusatory. It named her explicitly this time, suggesting bias, personal motive, influence. Her attorneys reviewed it and smiled thinly. It won't go anywhere, one said. Danielle wasn't so sure. Leonard still believed control could be reclaimed through persistence. But persistence worked both ways. She authorized the release of additional internal audits, voluntarily. Opened archives that hadn't been requested. Invited oversight where it wasn't required. The appeal stalled. Months passed. Leonard's letters stopped. The silence this time felt different. Not strategic. Final. One evening, Danielle stood alone in her office, watching rain streak the windows. The city moved on below, unaware of how close things had come to repeating themselves. She turned off the lights and gathered her coat. Power, she'd learned, wasn't about making decisions without consequence. It was about choosing consequences you were willing to face. And somewhere behind concrete walls and locked doors, Leonard Whitcomb was finally learning what it meant to run out of options. The story, however, wasn't finished. Because accountability didn't end with prison sentences. It echoed, quietly, persistently, into everything that came after. The settlement negotiations began without ceremony. No press releases. No dramatic announcements. Just a formal notice from the Department of Justice outlining restitution discussions tied to Leonard Whitcomb's conviction and the broader dismantling of Haverford's former structure. Danielle read the notice twice, then forwarded it to her legal team. This phase wasn't about punishment. It was about repair. Former employees came forward quietly, some through attorneys, others through handwritten letters. People who had been pushed out, demoted, labeled not a good fit. Their stories weren't identical, but they rhymed. Missed promotions, sudden performance reviews, unexplained terminations. Patterns again. Danielle insisted the process be handled independently. A third-party administrator. Clear criteria. Documentation reviewed without commentary on personal worth. We're not deciding who deserved better, she told the board. We're acknowledging harm. The first checks went out 3 months later. They weren't life-changing sums. They weren't apologies disguised as money. They were acknowledgments. One former analyst sent a brief note back. This doesn't erase what happened, it read. But it helps me stop doubting my memory. Danielle placed the note in her desk drawer. As restitution moved forward, another development surfaced. One that surprised even her. A class action lawsuit filed not against Leonard, but against the consulting intermediaries that had enabled the shell structures. Firms that had thrived in gray zones, confident no one would ever trace the lines back to them. Now the lines were visible. Danielle was asked to advise. She declined formal involvement but agreed to provide public testimony about structural risks. How opacity was sold as sophistication, how speed was valued over scrutiny. Her testimony was calm, technical, unassailable. Markets reacted. Other companies began preemptive audits. Boards requested independent reviews. Compliance officers were promoted instead of sidelined. The ripple effect widened. At a leadership retreat later that year, one director said quietly, "You've changed how people think about dissent." Danielle shook her head. "I didn't," she said. "I just stopped treating it like a threat." At home, life settled into something almost ordinary. Her son started high school. Complained about early mornings. Asked to borrow the car. Tested boundaries the way teenagers did. One evening, while she was reviewing documents at the kitchen table, he looked up and asked, "Do you ever wish you'd just stayed quiet back then?" The question landed heavier than he realized. Danielle considered it carefully. "Sometimes," she said honestly, "it would have been easier." "But you didn't," he said. "No," she replied. "Because quiet doesn't stay quiet. It turns into something else." He nodded, thoughtful. That winter, Danielle received a final update from Agent Harris. Leonard's appeal had been denied. No further avenues. Harris added a short note at the end. This case changed procedures internally. For us too. Danielle read that line twice. Accountability, she realized, wasn't contagious through outrage. It spread through example. Through the slow, uncomfortable work of doing things differently when no one was watching. On the anniversary of her termination, 10 years to the day, Danielle took the afternoon off. She didn't mark it publicly. She didn't tell anyone. She drove past the old building once. Not to linger. Just to acknowledge the distance traveled. Then she kept going. That night, as she prepared for bed, her phone buzzed with a notification from the company's internal system. An anonymous submission. She opened it. "I'm worried about a decision my manager asked me to approve. I don't think it's right." Danielle smiled faintly. She forwarded it to the review committee with a single note. "Thank you for speaking up." Somewhere far away, Leonard Whitcomb's world had narrowed to routines and limits. Danielle's had expanded, not through conquest but through care. And the most important outcome of everything she'd endured wasn't ownership or influence or even justice. It was proof that silence could be broken. And once it changed what people believed was possible. The invitation arrived in a plain white envelope, addressed by hand. Danielle almost missed it, mistaking it for another notice or request. When she opened it, she paused. A university in Ontario was hosting a closed-door symposium on corporate accountability. No press. No live stream. Just regulators, academics, and a handful of practitioners who had been part of cases that changed policy. They wanted her to speak. Not about Leonard. About what came after. Danielle hesitated before accepting. Visibility still carried risk. Not legal risk anymore, but narrative risk. The tendency for people to flatten complex stories into symbols. Still, she agreed. The symposium took place in late fall. Cold air. Gray skies. The kind of weather that made conversations feel more serious than intended. Danielle spoke last. She didn't tell her story chronologically. She didn't dramatize. Instead, she talked about incentives. About how organizations train people to ignore discomfort. About how retaliation was rarely explicit. It was procedural. "Most harm doesn't come from villains," she said to the quiet room. "It comes from systems that reward speed and punish friction." Afterward, a young professor approached her. "I study whistleblower behavior," he said. "Most people regret speaking up." Danielle considered that. "Most people regret being isolated," she replied. "That's different." The comment followed her home. Weeks later, Danielle noticed something subtle but profound. She was no longer waiting for the other shoe to drop. 4 years, even after Leonard's conviction, part of her had remained braced, expecting backlash, reversal, exposure. That tension had become so familiar she hadn't realized it was still there. Until it wasn't. One morning she woke up and simply felt present. At work, the company entered its first year without a single major regulatory finding. Minor issues surfaced, were addressed, logged, learned from. Nothing hidden. That was new. Then came an unexpected call. A non-profit legal clinic wanted to partner with her firm to create a pro bono compliance advisory service for small businesses, especially minority-owned firms that couldn't afford top-tier counsel but were disproportionately penalized for mistakes. Danielle listened quietly as the director explained. "They're held to the same standards," the woman said, "but without the same protection." Danielle agreed immediately. The work was slower, less lucrative, more personal. She reviewed policies for family-run operations, explained reporting requirements without judgment, helped founders correct errors before they became accusations. One evening, after a long session with a startup owner who reminded her painfully of herself years ago, Danielle sat in her car and let the silence settle. This felt like repair. Not just of systems, of self. At home, her son was studying for exams, headphones on, tapping a pencil against the table. "You're late," he said without looking up. "Worth it," she replied, smiling. That winter, Danielle received word that Leonard had been moved to a lower security facility due to good behavior. The update stirred nothing in her. No anger. No satisfaction. Just distance. She placed the notice in a folder she rarely opened anymore. Legacy. That word had once felt heavy, abstract. Now it felt practical. What did her work leave behind when she wasn't in the room? What habits did it reinforce? What courage did it make ordinary? One afternoon, Danielle overheard two junior staff members arguing, not angrily but openly, over a compliance interpretation. No whispers. No fear. She didn't intervene. She listened. Later she realized something else had changed. She no longer needed the story to end. The urge for a final moment, some perfect alignment of justice and acknowledgement, had faded. Life didn't resolve that way. It accumulated. And what had once been a wound had become a reference point. Not something she returned to, but something she carried, quietly shaping decisions. That night, as she turned off the lights in her office, Danielle paused at the window. The city below was busy, indifferent, alive. 10 years ago, she'd walked out of this same building with a box in her hands and uncertainty in her chest. Now she walked out carrying nothing at all. And that, she realized, was freedom. But one last chapter, unwritten, unresolved, was still approaching. Not in courtrooms or boardrooms, but somewhere far more public, and far less controlled. The documentary aired on a Sunday night. Danielle hadn't agreed to participate. At least, not directly. She learned about it the way most people did now, through a text message from a former colleague. You're going to want to see this. The production focused on corporate accountability failures of the last decade. Multiple cases. Multiple industries. Leonard Whitcomb's story was one segment among several. But Danielle's name appeared anyway. Not as a talking head. Not as a narrator. As a timeline marker. Internal objections raised by a senior analyst, the voiceover said, while blurred documents scrolled across the screen. Terminated shortly thereafter. The footage cut to archival images of Haverford's headquarters. Snow on the ground. Holiday decorations visible through glass. Christmas. Danielle sat on her couch, hands folded, watching without expression. The portrayal was restrained. Accurate. But something about seeing it flattened into minutes unsettled her. The internet reacted faster than she expected. Clips circulated. Comment threads filled with arguments about race, power, loyalty, ambition. Some people praised her restraint. Others accused her of opportunism. A few questioned her motives entirely. She read none of it directly. Her assistant summarized what mattered. There's pressure, she said carefully, for you to say something. Publicly. Danielle nodded. I won't. The next day, however, the pressure escalated. An open letter circulated online, signed by former employees across multiple companies, not just Haverford. It didn't mention Leonard. It didn't mention Danielle by name. It asked for one thing. Standards. Clear expectations. Protection for dissent. Consequences that didn't depend on who held power. News outlets framed it as a movement. They wanted a face. Danielle declined again. But then something unexpected happened. The request came from employees inside her own company. They didn't ask her to speak for them. They asked her to speak with them. A town hall. Internal. No press. Danielle agreed. The auditorium filled slowly. Engineers. Analysts. Legal staff. People she knew well and people she didn't. She stood at the podium without notes. I won't talk about my past, she began. Because it isn't the point. The room was silent. I'll talk about what I believe now, she continued, which is that accountability only works if it's boring, if it's consistent, if it doesn't depend on courage every single time. She paused. You shouldn't need to be brave to do your job. Heads nodded. That's the standard, Danielle said. And if we ever stop meeting it, I expect you to hold me to account too. Afterward, no one applauded immediately. They stood. The standing ovation came slowly, awkwardly, honestly. That night, Danielle received one last letter from Leonard. Shorter this time. I watched the documentary he wrote. I didn't recognize myself. Danielle folded the letter without rereading it and placed it in the legacy folder. Recognition, she knew, was not the same as understanding. In the weeks that followed, legislation was proposed. Incremental, imperfect, but real. Stronger whistleblower protections. Clearer audit requirements. Fewer gray zones disguised as innovation. Commentators debated its effectiveness. Danielle didn't. She focused on implementation, on culture, on the quiet work that never made headlines. One evening, as she walked to her car, a young woman approached hesitantly. "Miss Brooks?" she asked. "I just wanted to say, seeing someone who looks like me not disappear, it mattered." Danielle met her eyes. "You don't owe anyone silence," she said. "Not ever." The woman smiled, visibly relieved, and walked away. Danielle stood there for a moment longer, the city noise swelling around her. The story had escaped her control now. That was fine. It had become something larger, something shared. And with that sharing came a final reckoning, not of one man or one company, but of a culture that had thrived on invisibility. The last chapter wouldn't be written by courts or executives. It would be written by ordinary people choosing, again and again, not to look away. And Danielle, for the first time, was content to simply be part of that chorus. Not its center. Not its symbol. Just its proof. The prison visitation room smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper. Danielle hadn't planned to come. She told herself there was nothing left to say, nothing left to witness. Leonard Whitcomb was serving his sentence. The appeals were exhausted. The company he once ruled no longer existed in any form he would recognize. And yet, when the request came, formal, restrained, routed through attorneys, she surprised herself by agreeing. Not for him. For herself. They sat across from each other at a narrow table bolted to the floor. No glass. No phone. Just space and time. Leonard looked older than she expected. Not thinner, exactly, but worn in a way that couldn't be fixed with sleep or tailoring. His hands rested flat on the table, fingers spread slightly as if grounding himself. "Thank you for coming," he said. Danielle nodded once. "I won't stay long." He accepted that without protest. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet felt different here, contained, enforced. "I thought a lot about what I'd say if I ever saw you again," Leonard began. "I imagined arguments. Explanations." He exhaled slowly. "None of them matter now." Danielle watched him carefully. She wasn't searching for remorse. She wasn't waiting for an apology. "I didn't believe you'd follow through," he said. "Not because you weren't capable. Because I didn't think the system would allow it." "That's what you miscalculated," Danielle replied. "I didn't need it to allow me. I just needed it to record the truth long enough." Leonard looked down at his hands. "I told myself I was protecting something bigger," he said. "Growth. Stability. Legacy." "And you were protecting yourself," Danielle said gently. "Not accusing. Naming." He nodded once. "I see that now." They sat in silence again. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed. Footsteps echoed, then faded. "I'm not here to forgive you," Danielle said at last. "And I'm not here to punish you." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "I'm here to let go of the last version of myself that needed you to understand." Leonard swallowed. "That version is gone," she continued. "What happened to me doesn't define me anymore. What happened because of you will define you." She stood. Leonard didn't ask her to stay. As she walked out of the facility, the late afternoon sun caught her full in the face. She paused, letting the light warm her skin, breathing in air that smelled like cut grass and distant traffic. Freedom, she thought, wasn't the absence of pain. It was the absence of permission. In the months that followed, life settled, not into ease but into meaning. Her company continued its work, steady and unglamorous. Mistakes were caught early. Arguments happened in the open. People stayed longer than they used to. Danielle spent more time mentoring quietly. No cameras. No speeches. Just conversations over coffee with people navigating systems that still weren't fair, but were learning to be better. Her son graduated high school. At the ceremony, as she watched him cross the stage, she felt a familiar tightness in her chest. This time not from memory but from pride. From continuity. Later that night he asked her, "Do you think people will remember your story?" Danielle smiled. "I think they'll remember the outcome," she said. "And that's enough." The world moved on as it always did. But somewhere, A manager hesitated before silencing a concern. Somewhere, an employee documented instead of dismissing. Somewhere, a quiet voice was heard before it was erased. That was the real ending. Not the trial. Not the prison. But the shift. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think or reminded you of a moment when silence felt easier, take that feeling with you. These are the stories that deserve to be shared, the ones that ask us to pay attention. And if you want more stories like this, stories about power, accountability, and the quiet strength it takes to tell the truth, make sure you're subscribed. Stay with the channel. Add your voice when it matters. Because stories don't change the world on their own. People do. And this one is finished, but the conversation doesn't have to be.